Hello everyone, well done. You've made it to section A7, the last part of the responses section. So we'll be moving on to section B, which is fatigue and recovery. But in this section we're going to look at the sources of energy for the body, adenosine triphosphate, energy systems, 3 of them, the energy continuum, so which system we use for what type of activity, onset of blood lactate accumulation, and recovery, briefly. So let's start with the sources of energy. First of all, we've got adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, you will need to know how to spell this. It's the only energy that directly causes muscle contraction. So we know we can get energy from a battery, for example, but you can't use a battery to power muscle contraction. So resynthesizing or remaking adenosine triphosphate directly causes muscle contraction, so it's used by the muscles to contract. Phosphocreatine. This is a high energy compound made of 2 elements, phosphate and creatine, and they're found in the skeletal muscle cell. We're going to look at glycogen and glucose. Glycogen being the concentrated stored version of glucose. This is represented with the orange diagram up here. And we can see here it's 5 elements together in a molecule, so it's a big molecule. And we've got glucose, which is found only in the bloodstream here and derives from carbohydrate, is a single element, or a much smaller molecule. It's not a single element, it's a much smaller molecule. But glycogen is 5 times the size of it. So we like to say that the glycogen is a more concentrated version and is a stored version in the muscle cell and in the liver. And the glucose is set free and it's in a liquid form, if you like, within the blood. It's dissolved within the blood. So it's readily available to be dropped off at our muscle cell. But we're going to come back to that. We're going to look at fats. Now these are stored under the skin, and we know they can be stored around some major organs as well, and this isn't necessarily a good thing, but they can be dissolved into the blood as well. And when they are dissolved in the blood, they're known as fatty acids, not fat, and they can then be taken to the muscle cell and broken down for energy as well. In fact, they're very efficient at giving us energy. Protein, finally. It's our last source of energy, but we don't really use it. We're not going to talk about it too much. It is possible for us to break down protein and use it for energy, but we use it in emergency cases only. So say you were lost in the Amazon forest for 2 weeks and you were not taking in enough new nutrients, then your body would start to break down its own skeletal muscle to fund the energy for skeletal muscle contractions of the ones that you haven't internally eaten, if you like. So let's look at sources of energy and the resynthesis of adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. So it's the only energy that causes muscle contraction in our body. We have this molecule here called adenosine diphosphate. 1, 2 phosphates, so that's where the word or the part di comes from. There's 2 phosphates on 1 adenosine. So adenosine diphosphate. You can see from the pictures here that it's missing just 1 phosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, 1, 2, 3 phosphates on 1 adenosine is adenosine triphosphate. This is what we need for the energy. As you can see, I've done a lightning bolt. This is the energy, and it comes from when we break this final bond. And you can see it's different. It's a high energy bond, this one. This one doesn't have a high energy bond, but this one does. And when we're able to break these last 2 phosphate ions, we get a release of energy, and it's that energy we can use. Now you're going to learn a lot more about how that energy is used in Unit 2 with Miss Senior on the sliding filament theory. So we're looking at sources of energy in the ATP-PC system. So this is the first system that we're going to cover. We're looking at phosphocreatine, PC, phosphocreatine. and it's a compound, as you can see here, made up of 2 elements there. We have stores of them in our skeletal muscle, but those stores are very limited. We can train our muscle to store more of this. If we don't use it, our muscles will store less of this. Essentially, the phosphate and the creatine molecules are joined together with another high energy bond. That energy bond is broken by using an enzyme. This enzyme is called creatine kinase and is also in the skeletal muscle cell. When the enzyme is released into the muscle cell, it breaks the bond between phosphate and creatine, and the energy released resynthesizes an ATP molecule, an adenosine triphosphate molecule. We call this the energy yield. So from one compound, we get 1 ATP. This is the energy yield. No oxygen at all is required for this reaction to occur, so we call it an anaerobic system, meaning without oxygen. Now, it's excellent for giving us really quick energy. So if we need it for something like a shot put throw, or we're going to jump over something, or we have been jogging and we all of a sudden need to sprint or dodge around somebody. So we need a very quick and we need high intensity activity. So we need this energy very quickly and lots of it. We can use the ATP-PC system. So we're using PC, phosphocreatine, to resynthesize ATP. The problem is it only lasts for 8 to 10 seconds. So that's how much Usain Bolt would need to run his 100-metre sprint. We would certainly need it to start off and get halfway down the track. But here's some examples of when we might use it. Sprinting in a game situation or on the track. Jumping in a game situation or on a track. If we're hitting something and we're trying to hit it as hard as we can, if we're kicking the ball, these are high intensity activities or very quick activities. Now we can use the ATP-PC system for the beginning of exercise, but as we're 45 minutes into a match and we need to up our intensity, we will come back and use this system again. And then we will rest it for a bit so it can replenish itself and we can use it again. So we will use this multiple times throughout a game situation. So let's recap on what we've learned so far then. We've got adenosine triphosphate, which is 1 adenosine molecule attached to 3 phosphate ions. This last bond is what we call a high energy bond. And this is the bond that when it's broken, we get energy for muscle contraction. So let's look at how this is broken and where this phosphate comes from. So also within the muscle cell, we have the compound creatine phosphate. Between creatine phosphate, we are able to break it up and get more energy, and we are also able to free up a phosphate, which we can directly add to adenosine diphosphate to make adenosine triphosphate. So we've got phosphocreatine, we add in the phosphate ion only to resynthesize ATP, remake ATP from leftover ADP that we found in the muscle cell. How does this split? We split this with the enzyme. Do you remember what it was? Creatine kinase. Creatine kinase. So we've got ADP, adenosine diphosphate, in the muscle cell. We've got creatine phosphate, a high energy compound, meaning 2 elements, in the muscle cell. We have an enzyme, creatine kinase, in the muscle cell. When energy is required quickly for high intensity, creatine kinase is released. The release of creatine kinase breaks the phosphate off the compound creatine phosphate. The phosphate and energy are able to be transferred to ADP, which is in the muscle cell, to add on a phosphate ion to adenosine diphosphate and resynthesize, remake adenosine triphosphate. Now we have this ATP available for muscle contraction. Hope that makes sense. Just take a break now, do some exam questions, do some of the check your understanding questions on the OneNote page, look at your notes, read the textbook, read around the subject, watch another video on YouTube, and just try and get your head round adenosine triphosphate, diphosphate, and the ATP-PC system.